Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about a man who died whispering his greatest rival's name, unaware that his rival had died that same morning, 500 miles away. It reveals what happens when ambition and principle collide in a single human heart, and asks a question that echoes across 2.5 centuries. How should we live when history is watching? July 4th, 1826. Quincy, Massachusetts. The bedroom on the second floor of the farmhouse called Peacefield is stifling in the summer heat. The windows are open, but no breeze disturbs the heavy air. Outside, cannon fire celebrates the 50th anniversary of American independence. Inside, John Adams is dying. He lies in the bed where he has slept for decades, the same bed he shared with Abigail until her death 8 years ago. The sheets are damp with sweat. His breathing comes in shallow rasps, irregular, the sound of machinery grinding toward its inevitable halt. He is 90 years old. His body has betrayed him slowly, piece by piece, but his mind remains sharp, surfacing occasionally from the darkness like a swimmer gasping for air. His family surrounds him. His son John Quincy, the 6th President of the United States, sits nearest the bed. His granddaughter Susanna holds his hand. Others stand in the doorway, watching, waiting. They have been waiting for days now. Each breath might be the last. Each silence might be the final one. The room smells of sickness and summer flowers brought in from the garden. Sunlight slants through the windows, illuminating dust motes that hang suspended in the still air. Somewhere downstairs, a clock ticks. Outside, voices rise in celebration. Children laughing, adults toasting the nation's birthday. The world continues, indifferent to the ending of one man's story. Adam stirs. His lips move. The family leans closer. What wisdom will he leave them? What final summation of a life spent in the service of an idea? Thomas Jefferson survives. The words are barely audible, but they are clear enough. Thomas Jefferson, the name he has spoken thousands of times over 50 years. Friend, enemy, collaborator, rival. The man who wrote the words Adams fought to defend. The man who defeated him in the election that ended his presidency in humiliation. The man with whom he reconciled in old age through letters that became a conversation across the chasm of their differences. Thomas Jefferson survives. It is approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. What John Adams does not know, cannot know, is that Thomas Jefferson died that morning at Monticello, shortly after noon, 500 miles to the south. Jefferson's last words, witnesses would later report, were also about death and survival. Both men held on, somehow, to die on this day, the 4th of July, the birthday of the nation they made together. The cosmic coincidence will stun the nation when the news spreads. It will seem supernatural, providential, as if God himself arranged for the two last surviving signers of the Declaration to exit the stage together on the 50th anniversary of their greatest achievement. Some will call it miracle. Others will call it fitting. All will recognize it as the kind of symmetry that history rarely provides. But Adams does not know any of this. He believes Jefferson survives. Perhaps he takes comfort in it. Perhaps in his final moment of consciousness, he imagines his old friend still sitting at Monticello, still writing letters in that elegant hand, still believing in the perfectibility of man and the infinite possibilities of reason. Perhaps he thinks, at least Thomas will remember. At least someone who was there, who understood what we attempted, will remain to tell the story. Or perhaps it is more complicated than that. Perhaps even now, dying, Adams cannot escape the comparison that has haunted him for half a century. Jefferson survives, taller, more graceful, more beloved. Jefferson survives, the philosopher-statesman admired by Europe, while Adams was merely tolerated. Jefferson survives, the author of the Declaration, while Adams was only its defender. Even in death, even in this final moment, the rivalry remains. The wound never quite healed. Then John Adams dies. The cannon fire continues outside. The celebrations go on. America turns 50, unaware that it has just become an orphan. The question that should haunt us is this: who was this man? Not the marble statue in the textbooks, not the Adams of mythology, but the actual human being who just died whispering a rival's name. How did a vain, insecure, brilliant lawyer from Massachusetts, a man who craved recognition like other men craved food, who filled his diary with grandiose dreams and self-lacerating doubts, become the conscience of a revolution he didn't particularly want? Because that is the paradox of John Adams. He was never supposed to be the hero. He was too difficult, too prickly, too honest about his own ambitions, and too critical of everyone else's. He was not elegant like Jefferson, not commanding like Washington, not charming like Franklin. He was short, stout, vain, insecure, and argumentative. He worried constantly about his reputation while doing things guaranteed to destroy it. He defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. He avoided war with France when war was popular. He appointed justices on his way out of office in a fit of partisan spite. He was, in short, profoundly human, and history has never quite known what to do with him. His own assessment of himself, written decades earlier, captures the complexity. Quote 1, "It was true." And yet he also wrote, quote 2, "Also true." Both things existing simultaneously in the same breast: vanity and sacrifice, ambition and duty, the hunger for fame and the willingness to lose it for principle. For most of the 19th century, history did nothing with him. Adams died in relative obscurity, his reputation in tatters, overshadowed by Jefferson, by Washington, by the giants who had better press agents and simpler narratives. His warnings about democracy sounded elitist. His pessimism about human nature seemed contrary to American optimism. His very complexity worked against him in a nation that preferred its founders simple, heroic, and dead. It would take more than a century for Americans to rediscover him, to realize that his very flaws made him essential, that his pessimism was realism, that his warnings about demagoguery and faction and the fragility of Republican government were not the carping of an old Federalist, but the wisdom of someone who understood that freedom is harder than it looks. But to understand this moment, this man whispering his rival's name with his final breath, we must travel back to 1735, to a farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, where a boy is born who will never quite believe he is good enough and will spend 90 years proving it to a world that refuses to notice. The weight of 5 generations pressed down on the shoulders of a boy born October 30th, 1735, in a saltbox house on the Coast Road in Braintree, Massachusetts. He was named John Adams after his father, who was named after his father, in a line stretching back to Henry Adams, who had arrived from England in 1638 with nothing but Puritan conviction and a willingness to work stone-hard New England soil. The family had been in Massachusetts for nearly a century when young John arrived, And in all that time, not one of them had been remarkable. They were farmers, deacons, town selectmen, men who rose before dawn and worked until dark, who read their Bibles and kept their accounts, who served their communities and expected no recognition beyond a decent burial in the town cemetery. They were, in the Puritan sense, good men, which meant self-denying, God-fearing, suspicious of pleasure, and certain of their own sinfulness. This was the inheritance: duty without glory, service without reward, the satisfaction of a day's work done honestly even if no one noticed. John Adams Sr. embodied this tradition perfectly. He was a farmer first, working 40 acres of rocky land that grudgingly yielded crops. He was also a cordwainer, a maker of shoes, supplementing farm income with leather and awl. He served as town selectman, settled disputes, collected taxes, performed the thankless tasks that held a community together. He was respected, solid, a man whose word meant something. He expected his eldest son to follow the same path, to inherit the farm and the duty that came with it. Young John had other ideas. From his earliest years, the boy showed a temperament utterly unsuited to the life laid out before him. He hated farming, hated the monotony of it, the endless repetition, the way seasons dictated everything, and human will meant nothing against weather and soil. His father would wake him before dawn to help with chores, and the boy would drag himself from bed with resentment burning in his chest, mucking stalls, hauling water, splitting wood, planting, weeding, harvesting. All of it felt like prison. But books were freedom. His mother, Susanna Boylston Adams, came from a family slightly higher on the social ladder than the Adamses. The Boylstons had produced clergymen and merchants, men who worked with minds rather than hands. Susanna brought to her marriage a literacy rare among farm women and a religious severity that matched her husband's, but burned hotter, more intensely. She taught young John to read from the Bible, and once he learned, he could not stop. He read everything he could find. The Bible, yes, but also whatever books wandered into the house. Almanacs, newspapers, the occasional borrowed volume from the minister. Reading became escape, proof that there were worlds beyond Braintree, ideas larger than crop rotation and shoe leather. While his hands performed the tasks his father set him, his mind wandered elsewhere, imagining conversations with the authors of books, arguments he would make, speeches he would give. The tension between father and son grew as John approached adolescence. One day, driven to desperation by another dawn of farm work, the boy begged his father to let him quit school and just farm full-time, thinking perhaps that if he gave in completely to his father's wishes, the misery would somehow become bearable through acceptance. His father called his bluff. John Sr. said, they did, all day under the summer sun, bent double, cutting marsh grass that would be used for fodder and roofing, hands blistered, backs aching, mosquitoes feasting on exposed skin. At day's end, his father asked, "Well, John, are you satisfied with being a farmer?" The boy, exhausted and miserable, admitted he was not. "Then you must go to school and prepare for college," his father said. "For a farmer's life clearly doesn't suit you." It was decided. John would attend Harvard. The decision represented enormous sacrifice for the family. Tuition, lost labor on the farm, the risk that investing in one son's education might produce nothing but pride and disappointment. But John Adams Sr., for all his Puritan practicality, recognized something in his son that required cultivation. Whether it was ambition or ability or simply stubbornness, too powerful to redirect, the father chose to enable it. In August 1751, at age 15, John Adams entered Harvard College in Cambridge. He was a farmer's son among the sons of Boston merchants and distinguished families. His clothes were plainer, his manners rougher, his Latin shakier than most of his classmates. He felt the difference keenly. All his life he would feel it, the sense of being outside, looking in, not quite belonging to the circles of power and privilege he aspired to join. Harvard, in the 1750s, trained ministers primarily, though increasingly it educated lawyers and merchants as well. The curriculum was classical: Latin, Greek, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, natural philosophy. Students rose at dawn for prayers, attended lectures, recited lessons, debated propositions, all under the watchful eyes of tutors who still believed they were shaping the spiritual elite of Massachusetts. Adams threw himself into his studies with ferocious intensity. He was not the most brilliant student, but he was perhaps the most determined. He worked harder than his richer classmates, driven by the need to prove he belonged, to show that a farmer's son could match or exceed the Boston aristocrats. His pride would not allow him to be second-rate, but beneath the diligence lay something more complex. His diary, which he began keeping at Harvard and would maintain throughout his life, reveals a young man at war with himself. He recorded his failings obsessively, time wasted, studies neglected, his tendency toward, quote 5 and quote 6. He set impossible standards and flagellated himself for falling short. The Puritan inheritance, transmitted through his mother's severity and his father's example, manifested as a conscience that gave him no peace. Yet alongside the self-criticism ran grandiose fantasies. He imagined himself a great orator, swaying crowds with eloquence. He saw himself as a future leader, a man whose name would be remembered. The ambition was enormous, barely concealed, and it horrified him. Ambition was sin. Self-promotion was vanity. A good Puritan sublimated personal desire into service to God and community. But John Adams wanted glory, recognition, fame, wanted it desperately. Even as he tried to convince himself he wanted only to be useful, this tension between Puritan self-denial and raw ambition would define every choice he made for the rest of his life. He would always be torn between the voice that said, quote 7, and the voice that said, quote 8, between his father's quiet dignity and his own hunger to be acknowledged as exceptional. Late at night, in his Harvard dormitory, while other students slept, John Adams sat by candlelight, reading Cicero's orations. He read them aloud, softly, practicing the rhythms, imagining himself before the Roman Senate, arguing cases that would determine the fate of republics. The flame flickered, shadows danced on the walls. Outside, Cambridge slept, indifferent to the ambitions gestating in this small room. The boy from Braintree had found his calling, though he did not yet know where it would lead. He knew only that he would not be a farmer, would not live the quiet, dutiful life his ancestors had lived. He would be something more. He had to be. The hunger for it consumed him, even as he prayed for it to be taken away. Harvard was supposed to make him a minister. That was the expectation, the obvious path for a bright farm boy whose family scraped together tuition. The college had been founded in 1636 primarily to train Puritan clergy, and though by the 1750s It educated future lawyers and merchants as well. The assumption remained. Promising young men studied theology, took holy orders, and returned to small Massachusetts towns to shepherd souls towards salvation. John Adams had no intention of becoming a minister. The realization came gradually, a slow erosion of the certainty his parents possessed. At Harvard, he studied theology because it was required, read scripture because he had to, attended chapel because absence was punished. But the old doctrines, predestination, original sin, the essential depravity of human nature, struck him as increasingly arbitrary and cruel. If God predetermined who was saved and who was damned, what was the point of moral striving? If man was inherently wicked, why did virtue feel like choice rather than impossibility? He never became an atheist. The universe was too ordered, too magnificent, for mere accident. But the Calvinist God of his father, wrathful, inscrutable, damning infants for Adam's sin, began to seem less like divine truth and more like the projection of fearful men. Adams drifted towards something vaguer, more rational, a God who created natural law and then let men discover it through reason. Deism, though he would never quite embrace the label. His father, when John finally confessed he would not enter the ministry, received the news with quiet disappointment. John Adams Sr. had sacrificed for this education, imagining his son in a pulpit, serving God and community. Instead, the boy wanted to be a lawyer, a profession often associated with quarrels, tricks, and the pursuit of money. The father said little, but John felt the weight of it, another entry in the ledger of guilt he kept in his soul. In 1755, having graduated from Harvard in the middle of his class, not brilliant enough to stand first, too proud to be comfortable anywhere else, Adams moved to Worcester to teach school and study law with James Putnam, one of the town's leading attorneys. He was 20 years old, uncertain, ambitious, terrified of mediocrity. The legal apprenticeship was tedious beyond description. He copied documents in Putnam's cramped office, learning forms and procedures that seemed designed to drain the life from language. He read Coke's Institutes, 1,000 pages of medieval English law that made his eyes ache. He studied property law, contracts, torts, the accumulated weight of centuries of precedent that governed who owned what and who owed whom. But beneath the tedium, he began to glimpse something extraordinary. Law was not merely rules. Law was the architecture of social order, the invisible structure that allowed humans to live together without constant violence. Property rights meant a farmer could plant crops, confident no one would steal his harvest. Contracts created trust between strangers. Courts provided justice without blood feuds. Law, properly understood and applied, was what separated civilization from chaos. And more, law could be a tool of liberty. This revelation came slowly, through reading and observation. If law could restrain the powerful, if it could establish that even kings were bound by rules, then law became the guardian of human freedom. This idea that liberty required not just good intentions, but institutional architecture would become the foundation of everything Adams believed. In 1758, after 3 years with Putnam, Adams was admitted to the bar. He returned to Braintree and opened a law practice. He was 23 years old. He had no clients, no reputation, no money, and a crushing certainty that he was destined for greatness, coupled with an equally crushing fear that he would fail. His diary from these years, is almost painful to read. He recorded every success and failure, every moment of industry and laziness, every flash of brilliance and stupidity. "I have a faculty of making enemies," he wrote. "I am too stiff, too unyielding." Then, a few pages later, "I shall be obscure and forgotten unless I rouse myself." Then again, "Vanity, I am certain, is my cardinal vice and folly." The self-examination was relentless, obsessive, almost pathological. He could not simply do his work. He had to analyze whether he was doing it well enough, whether others recognized his abilities, whether he was wasting time that could be spent studying. He set himself schedules and broke them, made resolutions and abandoned them, dreamed of fame and condemned himself for dreaming. His first cases were small: boundary disputes, debt collection, minor property disagreements. He prepared for each one as if arguing before the House of Lords, reading every relevant precedent, crafting arguments, anticipating objections. The anxiety before each court appearance was nearly paralyzing. What if he forgot his points? What if the judge found him incompetent? What if his clients realized they had hired a fraud? But when he stood to argue, something happened. His preparation steadied him. His knowledge of law gave him authority. His conviction that he was right, that the law supported his client, came through in his voice. He won cases. Not all of them, but enough. His reputation grew slowly in the small world of Massachusetts county courts. Then, in 1761, he witnessed something that changed his understanding of what law could mean. The case was argued in the council chamber of the townhouse in Boston. At issue, writs of assistance, general search warrants that allowed British customs officials to enter any building to search for smuggled goods. Boston merchants, furious at this invasion of their property and privacy, challenged the writs. Their lawyer was James Otis, Jr., the most brilliant legal mind in Massachusetts. Adams crowded into the chamber with dozens of others to watch. Otis stood before the court and argued for 5 hours. Adams listened, transfixed. Otis did not simply cite precedent or pass statutes. He argued from first principles, from natural law, from the proposition that certain rights were so fundamental that no government could violate them. "A man's house is his castle," Otis declared, "and while he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle." The writs, Otis argued, were unconstitutional, void, regardless of what Parliament said, because they violated rights that existed prior to any government. The argument was radical, revolutionary even. It placed natural law above statute law, individual rights above governmental power. Otis lost the case. The court ruled for the crown. But Adams understood he had witnessed the birth of something profound. Then and there, Adams would write decades later, the child independence was born. For Adams, the lesson was clear. Law was not just neutral procedure or accumulated precedent. Law could be a weapon against tyranny, a shield for liberty, the mechanism through which humans protected themselves from power. This was what he wanted his career to be. Not just winning cases and earning fees, but using law to advance human freedom. He was admitted to the Suffolk County Bar in November 1758, arguing cases now in Boston itself, among the colony's elite lawyers and before its most respected judges. He was still young, still anxious, still filling his diary with self-recrimination and grandiose fantasies. But he had found his purpose, or thought he had. Late at night, in his Braintree study, He read Cicero and imagined himself defending the innocent, standing against corruption, using legal argument to preserve liberty. The ambition burned in him like fever. He would be great. He had to be. The alternative, living an ordinary life, dying forgotten, was unbearable. What he did not yet know was that greatness would require sacrificing the very recognition he craved, that defending liberty would make him hated, that his finest moments would be his most unpopular. But that understanding still lay ahead, waiting in a snowy street on a March evening 9 years hence, when British soldiers would fire into a crowd and John Adams would have to choose between his reputation and his principles. For now, he simply worked and worried and dreamed. He met her in the summer of 1762 at her father's parsonage in Weymouth, and she saw through him immediately. Abigail Smith was 17 years old, the daughter of Reverend William Smith and Elizabeth Quincy Smith. The Smiths were a step above the Adamses socially, not wealthy, but established. Her father held one of the most respected pulpits in Massachusetts. Her mother came from the Quincy family, well-connected, landed, the kind of people who had been important in the colony for generations. Abigail had been raised in a house where books lined the walls, where ideas were discussed at dinner, where a minister's daughter was expected to be literate, pious, and properly deferential. She was literate and pious. Deferential was another matter. She was small, dark-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. She had been sickly as a child, which meant she'd never been sent away to school. Instead, she'd educated herself in her father's library, reading whatever she could reach. Shakespeare, Milton, Pope, novels she wasn't supposed to read, political essays that weren't meant for female minds. She thought about what she read, formed opinions, expressed them sometimes when she forgot to be quiet. John Adams, visiting Weymouth on legal business, was introduced to the Smith family by a mutual friend. He was 26, a lawyer on the rise, already developing a reputation for brilliance and difficulty. He noticed Abigail immediately. She was reading when he arrived and barely looked up. When she did speak, it was to make a point about something her father had said, politely but firmly disagreeing with the minister in his own house. Adams was fascinated and slightly horrified. Young women were not supposed to argue about ideas. But here was this slight girl with her book and her opinions, completely unaware that she was violating every rule of proper feminine behavior. Or perhaps not unaware. Perhaps simply indifferent. Their courtship unfolded through letters. Adams, riding the legal circuit, wrote to her from various Massachusetts towns letters that showed off his learning, his wit, his grasp of Latin and Greek. He could not help himself. He needed to impress her, to prove he was worthy of someone above his station. Abigail replied in kind, but with a difference. Her letters matched his for intelligence, but they also contained something he'd never encountered before, gentle mockery. When he grew too pompous, she deflated him. When he pontificated, she asked innocent-sounding questions that revealed the gaps in his argument. When he showed off his classical learning, she quoted back to him with equal facility, then added a domestic detail, the weather, a sick relative, the price of butter, that brought him back to earth. He called her Miss Adorable in his letters. She called him Dear Sir at first, then gradually Friend, letting affection seep in slowly, carefully. as if testing whether this intense, anxious, brilliant young man could be trusted with her heart. What she offered him was something he had never found and would never find elsewhere: intellectual equality. She could follow his arguments, challenge his assumptions, match his reading. She understood his ambition without being intimidated by it. She saw his vanity and anxiety and need for recognition, and she did not despise him for it. Instead, she provided what he lacked: clarity where he had confusion, pragmatism where he had abstraction, calm where he had tempest. The dynamic was established early. He would spiral into anxiety about his reputation, his cases, whether he was doing enough, being enough. She would listen, then ask a simple question that cut through the spiral. "But did you do your best?" He would confess some failure, some moment of vanity or pride. She would raise one eyebrow. Just that, a slight lift. And he would hear everything she didn't say. "You're being ridiculous. You know better. Stop indulging yourself and get back to work." That eyebrow, it could deflate his self-importance faster than any argument. Over 54 years of marriage, it would save him from himself countless times. They were married on October the 25th, 1764, in the Smith's parlor in Weymouth. Abigail was 19, John was 28. The wedding was small, family only, nothing elaborate. Reverend Smith performed the ceremony. Afterward, they rode to Braintree, to the small house John had inherited from his father, who had died 2 years earlier. The timing was significant, though they could not have known it. In London, Parliament was preparing the Stamp Act, the tax on colonial documents that would ignite the crisis leading to revolution. But in October 1764, John and Abigail Adams were simply newlyweds, setting up house, beginning the intricate work of learning to live together. Their early married life established patterns that would hold for decades. John maintained his law practice, riding circuit through Massachusetts towns, arguing cases, building his reputation. Abigail managed the farm. Yes, the farm he'd sworn he'd never work. She kept the accounts, supervised the planting, handled everything domestic, so John could focus on his career. She also began having children. Abigail, quote Forfemans, was born in 1765, John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, who died before her second birthday, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772. The pregnancies, the births, the endless work of keeping children alive in an era when half died before adulthood. All of this fell to Abigail. But unlike most women, she also read, thought, wrote, engaged with the political crisis building around them. Their partnership was unusual. John discussed his cases with her, his political concerns, his fears about where the conflict with Britain was heading. She offered opinions he actually listened to. When he was away, which was often, they wrote letters, hundreds of letters over the years, that were conversations between equals about ideas that mattered. Most marriages of their time divided sharply, men in the public sphere, women in the private. John and Abigail's marriage blurred those lines. He needed her not just as wife and household manager, but as intellectual companion, moral compass, reality check. She needed him to take her seriously, to treat her mind as worthy of engagement. Years later, after Abigail's death, John would write that she had been his five, the mechanism that kept him from spinning out of control. He saw himself as machinery, powerful but erratic, requiring external regulation to function properly. She provided that regulation through partnership, through the steady application of sense and perspective that allowed his brilliance to operate without destroying itself. One small moment captures their dynamic perfectly. Early in their marriage, John came home agitated about some slight, some failure to receive proper recognition. He paced the kitchen, rehearsing his grievances, working himself into indignation. Abigail listened while kneading bread. When he paused for breath, she looked up, raised that eyebrow, and asked, Quote 6. He stopped, stared at her, then, despite himself, laughed. He said. She replied, returning to her bread. Quote 10. He brought in the firewood. This was the partnership that would sustain him through revolution, diplomacy, presidency, and defeat. Not because she agreed with everything he did, she often didn't, but because she knew him completely and loved him anyway, and would not let him disappear into either his grandiosity or his despair. The Stamp Act reached Boston in the fall of 1765, and the city lost its mind. The act itself seemed simple enough on paper. A tax on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, anything requiring paper. Parliament's logic was straightforward. The French and Indian War had cost Britain a fortune. The colonies had benefited from British protection. Therefore, the colonies should help pay the debt. A stamp tax, already used in Britain, seemed the obvious solution. What Parliament failed to understand was that Americans had grown used to governing themselves in all matters of internal taxation. For a century and a half, colonial assemblies had held the power of the purse. Now Parliament claimed it could tax Americans directly, without their consent, without their representatives having any say. The principle was clear. If Parliament could impose one tax, it could impose any tax. And if it could tax without representation, what did representation mean? Boston erupted. Mobs hanged the stamp distributor in effigy, then destroyed his office. They ransacked the lieutenant governor's mansion, throwing furniture into the street, stealing his wine, destroying his library. The violence shocked Adams. He opposed the Stamp Act as fiercely as anyone. Taxation without representation was tyranny, clearly, but mobs destroying property, threatening lives, replacing British tyranny with American anarchy, this was not liberty. This was chaos dressed in patriotic garb. His cousin, Samuel Adams, saw things differently. Sam was a failed businessman turned master propagandist, a man who understood that revolution required passion, not just legal arguments. Sam helped organize the Sons of Liberty, the network of merchants and artisans and rowdies who enforced resistance through intimidation and violence when necessary. Sam believed the people's anger was righteous, that sometimes property needed to be destroyed to defend rights. John disagreed, but carefully. He wrote a pamphlet, quote 0, arguing that American liberty had deep roots in Saxon tradition, that freedom from arbitrary power was the colonists' birthright. The pamphlet was brilliant, learned, making its case through history and philosophy rather than mob action. It made his reputation as a thinker, a man who could articulate the principles underlying resistance. But principles and mobs were uneasy allies. Through the late 1760s, tensions escalated. Britain sent troops to Boston to enforce order. 2 regiments of redcoats quartered in a city that hated them. surrounded by people who saw them as instruments of oppression. The soldiers were mostly poor men, Irish and English, far from home, facing daily insults and occasional violence. Brawls broke out between soldiers and locals, particularly around the rope walks, where workers and off-duty soldiers competed for jobs. March 5th, 1770. Evening. Snow on the ground, the air bitter cold. A crowd gathered near the Custom House on King Street, taunting the lone sentry. More soldiers arrived to support him. The crowd grew, 50, 60, 70 people, pressing closer, throwing snowballs, ice, chunks of wood, shouting insults. Lobsters! Bloody backs! Fire, damn you! Fire! Someone struck a soldier with a club. Another soldier was knocked down. In the confusion, shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent. Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr, who had died days later. Several others wounded. The city nearly exploded. 9 British soldiers were arrested and charged with murder, along with their captain, Thomas Preston. The soldiers sat in jail, facing trial in a city that wanted them hanged. No lawyer in Boston would touch their defense. Taking the case meant defending the hated British, aligning yourself with the occupation, betraying the cause of liberty. Then someone knocked on John Adams' door. The visitor was Captain Preston's merchant representative, James Forrest, likely sent by the loyalist Josiah Quincy Sr. Would Adams defend the soldiers? Adams understood immediately what saying yes would cost him. His practice, his reputation, his standing with the Patriots, all at risk. Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty would see it as betrayal. The town would whisper that he'd sold out, chosen British gold over American liberty. He said yes. Why? The reasons were complex, layered, partly principle. Everyone deserved counsel, even British soldiers. Partly his legal philosophy. Law meant nothing if it could be bent by passion and politics. Partly defiance. The mob did not get to dictate who deserved justice. And partly, perhaps, a perverse pride in doing the unpopular thing, proving his integrity by sacrificing his popularity. The isolation was immediate. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. His law practice suffered. Whispers followed him. Adams the turncoat, Adams the loyalist, Adams who valued British lives over American blood. He absorbed it all, kept preparing his case, told himself that history would vindicate him, even as the present condemned him. The trial began in October 1770. Adams stood before a packed courtroom, facing jurors who were his neighbors, arguing before citizens who had already decided the soldiers' guilt. The pressure was immense, but pressure was where Adams excelled. His strategy was simple: establish reasonable doubt. He did not need to prove the soldiers innocent, only that the prosecution could not prove them guilty beyond reasonable doubt. He called witnesses who testified that the crowd had been aggressive, threatening, violent. He established that the soldiers had been struck, that they feared for their lives, that in the chaos and darkness they had fired in self-defense. Then came the summation, the moment when John Adams delivered the line that would echo through American legal history. He stood before the jury and said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Facts are stubborn things." It was his governing principle. the foundation of everything he believed about law and justice. Passion was easy. Outrage was easy. Declaring the soldiers guilty because the mob wanted blood was easy. But law required something harder. Looking at evidence, weighing testimony, setting aside what you wanted to be true, and grappling with what actually was true. The jury deliberated. The verdict: Captain Preston, acquitted. 6 soldiers, acquitted. 2 soldiers, convicted of manslaughter, punished by branding on the thumb, and released. Not perfect justice, perhaps, but justice according to law rather than mob rule. Adams had won, and in winning, he had done something remarkable. He had defended the most hated men in Boston and walked away with his reputation not destroyed, but paradoxically enhanced. People might have disagreed with his choice, but they could not deny his courage or his principles. He had proven that American justice could be more than British justice, that it could be fair even to enemies, that it could resist passion in favor of evidence, that it could be worthy of the liberty it claimed to defend. Years later, Adams would write that defending the soldiers was one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. The statement sounds paradoxical. How is defending British soldiers who killed Americans a service to America? But Adams understood something profound. A nation built on law rather than power, on rights rather than force, had to prove it meant what it said. If Americans wanted justice, they had to give justice. If they wanted rights, they had to respect rights, even for their enemies. The Boston Massacre trial was John Adams at his best and most difficult. Principled, stubborn, willing to sacrifice popularity for integrity, constitutionally unable to let the mob dictate what law should be. It cost him, as principle always did, but it also defined him, established him as something rare, a man whose commitment to justice outweighed his hunger for approval. That commitment would be tested again and again in the years ahead. But on a cold December day in 1770, standing in a Boston courtroom having just saved 9 British soldiers from the gallows, John Adams had proven to himself and his city that he meant what he said about law, about rights, about the difference between liberty and license. The mob did not get to decide. Facts did. And facts, as he said, were stubborn things. The coercive acts arrived in Boston like a sentence of death. Parliament's response to the Tea Party was comprehensive and brutal. Close Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, revoke Massachusetts's charter, place the colony under military rule, allow British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than face colonial juries. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. Boston chose defiance, and Massachusetts chose John Adams as one of 5 delegates to the First Continental Congress, called to meet in Philadelphia in September 1774 to coordinate colonial response. Adams was 38 years old. He had never traveled outside New England. Now he would meet representatives from 12 colonies, men he knew only by reputation, the great planters of Virginia, the merchants of New York, the intellectuals of Pennsylvania. His excitement was almost painful. The terror matched it. What if he embarrassed himself? What if the Harvard-educated lawyer from Braintree proved himself a provincial fool among cosmopolitan gentlemen? The Congress convened in Carpenter's Hall on September 5th, 1774. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathering to decide how to respond to British tyranny without quite committing treason. Adams looked around the room and saw the men who would shape the next decade. George Washington, tall and silent in his Virginia militia uniform. Patrick Henry, the orator. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and from Virginia, a tall, red-haired young planter named Thomas Jefferson. Adams threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He served on committees, drafted resolutions, argued points of procedure and principle. He quickly established himself as one of the most forceful advocates for strong resistance. But he also grew frustrated. So much talk, so much debate, so much time spent on fine points of language, while Massachusetts suffered under military occupation. The first Congress achieved something: a Continental Association to boycott British goods, a statement of rights, an agreement to reconvene if Britain did not address grievances. Then the delegates went home, and Adams returned to Braintree uncertain whether anything had been accomplished beyond talk. The answer came April 19th, 1775. Lexington and Concord. British troops marching to seize colonial weapons. Minutemen gathering to resist. Shots fired. 8 Americans dead on Lexington Green. The British retreating to Boston under continuous fire, losing hundreds of men. War had begun, not through decision, but through accident, collision. The logic of escalation making peace impossible. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 with war already underway. An army surrounded Boston. Thousands of militiamen from across New England, organized but lacking coordination, equipment, and leadership. Congress had to decide: would they support this army? Would they transform resistance into revolution? Adams understood that supporting the army meant appointing a commander, and appointing a commander meant making a political choice that would shape everything. New England had started this war. If a New Englander commanded, it would remain New England's war. But if a Virginian commanded, it would become America's war, binding the colonies together through shared military leadership. On June 14th, 1775, Adams rose to nominate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was a brilliant political move and a personal sacrifice. Adams believed the Massachusetts General Artemus Ward deserved the position. But Ward was a New Englander. Washington was a Virginian, wealthy, respected, a veteran. Washington could unite the colonies. Ward could not. Washington accepted, and the Revolution had its general. Adams had made it happen, establishing his role. The man who made difficult decisions, who chose effectiveness over sentiment, who understood that winning required more than righteousness. Through 1775 and into 1776, Adams became the engine of independence. Not its voice, that would be others, men with more eloquence. But its engine, the man who pushed, argued, wore down opposition, refused to accept delay. He served on committees, drafted documents, answered correspondence, worked from dawn until midnight, driving toward the conclusion he saw as inevitable: independence. The word most delegates feared to speak, Adams insisted on. Reconciliation was impossible, he argued. Britain had made his choice. America must make its own. Every day of delay weakened the cause, confused the purpose, left soldiers dying without knowing what they died for. In June 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution. Congress debated. Some delegates wanted more time. Some feared the consequences. Some hoped for reconciliation still. Adams argued. Day after day, he stood and made the case for independence, not with soaring rhetoric, that was never his strength, but with logic, with law, with the relentless accumulation of reasons why independence was both necessary and right. He wore people down. That was his gift. If gift it was, the sheer stubborn refusal to stop arguing until opposition exhausted itself. Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. They met to divide the work. Jefferson, young, shy, known for his elegant writing, was assigned to draft the document. Adams would defend it. It was the perfect division of labor. Jefferson could write what Adams could not: the soaring language, the universal principles, the poetry that would make the Declaration immortal. Adams could do what Jefferson would not: stand before Congress and fight for every word, answer every objection, refuse every compromise that weakened the message. July 2nd, 1776. The vote on independence. Adams had spent the previous days in final arguments, addressing doubts, promising support, building the coalition that would make independence unanimous, or nearly so. When the vote came, 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained, but would later concur. The thing was done. America had declared itself independent. Adams was certain this date, July 2nd, would be remembered forever, celebrated by future generations as the birthday of American freedom. He wrote to Abigail that day, describing how the 2nd of July, quote, 1, quote 2. He was right about everything except the date. July 4th, when the formal declaration was approved and sent to the printer, became the celebrated anniversary. Adams' passionate prediction was fulfilled, but 2 days off. The irony would have amused him if it didn't also sting. What Adams felt in those early July days was complex. Triumph, certainly. He had pushed this through, made it happen against resistance and doubt. But also terror. He had just committed treason. If Britain won this war, he would hang. His family would be disgraced. His property would be confiscated. Everything he had built would be destroyed. And beneath the terror, something deeper. Doubt. Was independence necessary? Or had his own impatience pushed America into war before all alternatives were exhausted? The questions haunted him, as they would for years. He believed he was right, but belief was not the same as certainty, and the stakes were too high for error. In Philadelphia in early July 1776, John Adams had become what he never quite intended to be, a revolutionary. Not from love of violence or hatred of England, but from conviction that law and liberty required independence, that halfway measures would satisfy no one, that the logic of events demanded conclusion. He had helped birth a nation. Now came the harder part, keeping it alive. That task would consume the next decade of his life, carry him across an ocean, separate him from Abigail and his children. But in July 1776, fresh from victory in Congress, he could not know all that lay ahead. He knew only that he had done what he believed was right, and that history would judge whether he was correct. February 1778. The frigate Boston pitched and rolled in winter Atlantic swells. Below deck, John Adams lay in his cramped cabin, seasick, miserable, questioning every decision that had brought him here. Beside him, his 10-year-old son, John Quincy, tried to read by candlelight while the ship groaned and creaked around them. Adams had left Abigail behind in Massachusetts, along with their 3 other children, Nabby, Charles, and Thomas. He had left his law practice, his farm, everything familiar. Congress had appointed him commissioner to France, joining Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee in seeking French support for the revolution. It was an honor, a duty, a chance to serve the cause at the highest level. It was also exile. The voyage took 6 weeks of storms and danger. When they finally reached France in April, Adams discovered he was essentially unnecessary. Franklin had already secured the French alliance. The treaty was signed. Adams's commission was redundant, his presence superfluous. He had crossed an ocean, left his family, risked his life. For nothing. Paris made everything worse. The city dazzled and repelled him simultaneously. The sophistication, the culture, the salons where philosophers and nobles discussed ideas over wine. It should have been paradise for a man who loved intellectual conversation. Instead, it was torture. Benjamin Franklin was everywhere, beloved, celebrated, the darling of French society. At 72, Franklin moved through Paris like visiting royalty. French ladies adored him. Philosophers quoted him. He attended salons in his plain brown coat and fur cap, playing the role of rustic American sage while conducting diplomacy through charm and innuendo. Adams could not have been more different. He spoke no French and refused to learn beyond basic phrases. He found the salons frivolous, the French aristocrats decadent, the whole business of diplomatic flattery dishonest. Where Franklin charmed, Adams lectured. Where Franklin hinted, Adams stated bluntly. Where Franklin wore his fur cap, Adams wore his New England rectitude like armor. The contrast between them became a source of constant frustration. Franklin seemed to accomplish everything through indirection and pleasure. Adams believed in direct argument, clear positions, honest dealing. Franklin thought Adams was rigid and tiresome. Adams thought Franklin was dangerously lax and possibly corrupt. They worked together because duty required it, but the partnership was poisoned by mutual incomprehension. Adams felt useless, undermined, unappreciated. His reports to Congress went unanswered. His suggestions were ignored. Franklin, as senior commissioner, controlled access to the French court. Adams found himself with nothing to do but observe and seethe. He wrote bitter letters to friends, complaining about French corruption and American disorganization. He filled his diary with criticism of everyone, especially Franklin. In August 1779, unable to bear the uselessness any longer, Adams returned home. He had been gone 18 months and accomplished nothing he could point to. But Congress, in its wisdom, immediately sent him back to Europe, this time with a clear mission. He would negotiate peace with Britain when the time came. Until then, he should make himself useful wherever he could. He sailed again in November 1779, this time taking both John Quincy and 9-year-old Charles. The ship nearly sank in a storm. They landed in Spain and traveled overland to Paris through winter, a grueling journey that took months. Charles, homesick and miserable, eventually returned to America. John Quincy stayed, beginning an education in diplomacy that would shape his life. Adams decided he needed a different field of operation, somewhere Franklin's shadow didn't fall. He chose the Netherlands. The Dutch were wealthy, potentially sympathetic to American independence, and crucially, not yet committed. If Adams could secure Dutch recognition and loans, he could prove his worth. Holland became his obsession, and his triumph. For 2 years, from 1780 to 1782, Adams worked to persuade the cautious Dutch that America was worth the risk. He wrote pamphlets, gave interviews, met with bankers and politicians, wore down resistance through sheer persistence. The Dutch Republic moved slowly, carefully, reluctant to offend Britain. Adams moved relentlessly, refusing to accept delay. In April 1782, the Dutch recognized American independence. In June, they agreed to a treaty of commerce. In October, Adams secured a loan of 5 million guilders. It was his greatest diplomatic achievement, accomplished through methods that were purely Adams. No charm, no seduction, just relentless argument and stubborn refusal to quit. Then came the peace negotiations. Britain, exhausted by war and defeated at Yorktown, was finally ready to talk. The American commissioners, Adams, Franklin, and John Jay, met with British negotiators in Paris through the fall of 1782. Despite their differences, the Americans worked together effectively. Franklin provided the diplomatic finesse, Jay the legal precision, Adams the determination to secure favorable terms. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, gave America everything it needed: independence recognized, boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, fishing rights off Newfoundland. It was a diplomatic triumph, and Adams had been central to it. But triumph brought no rest. Congress appointed him the first American minister to Britain. In 1785, Adams traveled to London, the city he had spent a decade opposing, to represent the nation that had rebelled against British rule. The presentation of credentials to King George III was excruciating. Adams stood before the man his country had declared a tyrant, dressed in formal diplomatic attire, and delivered a careful speech about hoping for renewed friendship. George III responded with cold courtesy, acknowledging the appointment while making clear his displeasure at the circumstances. It was humiliation dressed in protocol, and Adams felt every moment of it. At least, he was no longer alone. Abigail had finally joined him in 1784, after 4 years of separation. Their reunion in London was everything separation had made them hunger for: companionship, conversation, the ease of understood partnership. She helped him navigate London society, manage their household, provided the emotional ballast he desperately needed. Their letters during the years of separation form one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. Hundreds of letters crossing the ocean, taking months to arrive, containing everything: political analysis, farm management, worries about children, expressions of loneliness and love. Abigail managed the farm and the family alone, made financial decisions, survived the war at home, while John survived exile abroad. Their partnership persisted across 3,000 miles of ocean through the sheer determination to maintain it. London was difficult in different ways than Paris. The British treated Adams with barely concealed contempt, the rebel lawyer now pretending to be a diplomat. American interests were routinely ignored. Trade agreements were blocked. Adams spent 3 frustrating years accomplishing little, feeling the weight of British disdain and American indifference. But those years in Europe, 10 years total, from 1778 to 1788, transformed his thinking about government. He watched European monarchies, studied their structures, observed how power operated in old, established nations. He saw the weakness of the Confederation Congress, unable to pay its debts or command respect. He became convinced that America needed a stronger central government, a more powerful executive, institutional structures that could actually function. These observations would shape his political philosophy for the rest of his life. Republican government required not just virtue but institutions. Liberty needed protection through constitutional architecture, not just good intentions. The weak Confederation would fail. America needed a real government, and soon. When Adams finally returned home in 1788, he had been away for most of a decade. His children had grown up without him. His youngest sons barely knew him. He had missed years of their lives, years with Abigail, years of home and family, all sacrificed to public service. The cost was enormous. The compensation was negligible. The recognition was non-existent. He had helped secure French alliance, Dutch recognition, British peace, all while feeling useless and unappreciated. It was the pattern of his life, serving at great personal cost while others received the credit. But he had served. That counted for something, even if only to himself. And he was coming home to a nation debating a new constitution, about to remake itself. Perhaps there would be a role for him yet in the government being born. Perhaps the sacrifice had been worth it. He allowed himself to hope, even as experience taught him that hope was usually disappointed. The new constitution was ratified in 1788, and John Adams had helped make it possible. His 3-volume defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States, written during his London years, had provided intellectual ammunition for those arguing that Republican government required strong institutions, balanced powers, and a vigorous executive. The work was dense, learned, packed with historical examples from ancient republics to modern European states. Few people read it all the way through, but everyone acknowledged its importance. The first presidential election under the new Constitution was a foregone conclusion. George Washington would be president, unanimously, inevitably, the only man trusted by all sides. The vice presidency was an afterthought. Under the original electoral system, each elector cast 2 votes for president. Whoever came in second became vice president. Adams received the second most votes, 34 to Washington's 69. He was vice president by default, runner-up, the man who lost. He arrived in New York, the temporary capital, in April 1789 for Washington's inauguration, uncertain what his role would be beyond presiding over the Senate. Almost immediately, he made a mistake that would haunt him for years. The Senate needed to decide how to address the president. Adams, drawing on his European experience, proposed elaborate titles. His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of their liberties, or perhaps His Excellency. He argued that Republican government needed dignity, that European nations would not respect a mere Mr. President. The Senate rejected the proposal. So did the House. So did the public, which began calling Adams his rotundity, mocking both his political pretensions and his expanding waistline. The ridicule stung because it was deserved. Adams had been tone-deaf to American Republican sensibility, suggesting monarchical trappings for a nation that had just fought a war to escape monarchy. It was a humiliating beginning. Then came the deeper realization, the one that would define the next 8 years. The vice presidency was nothing. Adams himself would later write, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. He was right. The Constitution gave the Vice President exactly one duty: presiding over the Senate. He could vote only to break ties. He had no executive authority, no cabinet position, no real role in the Washington administration. He was a spare part, kept in storage in case the president died. Otherwise, he was ornamental, irrelevant, forgotten. For a man who had spent decades at the center of revolution, diplomacy, and nation-building, the irrelevance was torture. He sat in the Senate chamber day after day, presiding over debates he could not join, watching younger men argue policy while he remained silent. He often brought books, reading while senators talked, occasionally looking up when procedure required his attention. His habit of reading became notorious. The vice president so bored by his own job that he couldn't stay focused on it. The tie-breaking votes provided his only real power. In 8 years, Adams cast 31 tie-breaking votes, more than any vice president in history. Each vote was significant because it decided an otherwise deadlocked question. But the votes also placed him in an impossible position. Choosing sides in debates, he officially transcended, making enemies among those he voted against, and the sides were hardening rapidly. The Washington administration began splitting almost immediately between two factions. Alexander Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, pushed for a strong federal government, national banks, commercial development, close ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, advocated for states' rights, agricultural interests, sympathy with revolutionary France. The divide became the fault line of American politics. Adams was caught between. Philosophically, he was closer to Hamilton. He believed in strong central government, balanced budgets, institutional stability. But personally, he distrusted Hamilton, sensing in him a dangerous ambition and a contempt for Republican virtue. Jefferson was an old friend, a colleague from the Continental Congress, but Jefferson's faith in radical democracy, his optimism about human nature, struck Adams as naive and dangerous. Neither faction trusted Adams. Hamilton found him too independent, too principled, too unwilling to be managed. Jefferson found him too conservative, too skeptical of popular sovereignty. Washington treated him with polite respect and almost total disregard, never consulting him on major decisions, never bringing him into the inner circle of governance. The sense of being forgotten, overlooked, unappreciated, all the old anxieties from his youth came flooding back. He tried to suppress the feelings, told himself that serving was its own reward, reminded himself that he was still vice president, still involved in the great experiment of Republican government. But the feelings wouldn't stay suppressed. His sensitivity to slights became legendary, a dinner invitation not received, a consultation not sought, a newspaper article that praised others while ignoring him. Each tiny slight registered, accumulated, fed the gnawing sense that he had been pushed aside. He wrote bitter letters to Abigail, who had remained in Massachusetts much of the time, managing the farm, raising the family. He filled his diary with complaints and self-justification. Meanwhile, the political divide deepened into something uglier. Newspapers affiliated with each faction attacked the other with increasing viciousness. Hamilton's faction became the Federalist Party, advocating for commercial growth and British alignment. Jefferson's faction became the Democratic Republican Party, defending agrarian interests and French revolutionary ideals. The partisanship Washington had warned against in his farewell address was already entrenched and vicious. Adams watched it all from his Senate chair, presiding over debates that were becoming bitter, personal, dangerous. He saw men he respected descending into faction, saw principles abandoned for party loyalty, saw the experiment in Republican government threatened not by external enemies, but by internal division. Washington announced in 1796 that he would not seek a third term. His farewell address, actually written largely by Hamilton, warned against faction, against permanent foreign alliances, against the forces tearing the nation apart. It was magnificent and futile. The warnings would be ignored almost immediately. Adams knew he would run for president. He was the obvious Federalist candidate, Washington's vice president for 8 years, a founder with unquestioned revolutionary credentials. But he also knew he would be stepping into impossible shoes. Washington was beloved, almost worshipped, a figure of unanimous respect. Adams was none of those things. He was controversial, difficult, trusted by no faction completely, carrying 8 years of accumulated resentment at being sidelined. The gnawing anxiety returned. What if he failed? What if he proved unequal to Washington, unable to command the respect that had made Washington's presidency possible? What if the partisanship he'd watched developing for 8 years destroyed his presidency before it began? But beneath the anxiety was something else: determination. He had earned this. He had served through revolution, diplomacy, 8 years of irrelevance. He deserved the presidency, not because he was beloved or charming or politically skilled, but because he had sacrificed, endured, remained committed to Republican principles when they were under siege. In December 1796, the electoral votes were counted. Adams won by 3 votes over Jefferson, 71 to 68. Under the constitutional system, Jefferson, his old friend, now his political rival, would become his vice president. The man who had spent 8 years as Washington's irrelevant subordinate would now have his own rival in the same position, watching, waiting, plotting. The vice presidency had been 8 years of frustration, irrelevance, and gathering partisan storms. The presidency would be 4 years of crisis, betrayal, and the loneliest decisions of his life. But at least, finally, he would be more than an afterthought. At least he would matter, even if mattering meant making enemies and losing the popularity he'd never quite possessed. He would be president. He would do his duty. He would sacrifice his reputation if necessary for what he believed was right. The Senate years had taught him that much, that serving mattered more than being loved, that principle mattered more than popularity. History would judge whether that belief was wisdom or delusion. But in early 1797, preparing to take the oath of office, John Adams believed it absolutely, even as he feared what was coming. John Adams took the oath of office on March 4th, 1797, in the chamber of the House of Representatives in Philadelphia. George Washington sat nearby, visibly relieved to be surrendering power. Thomas Jefferson stood as well, now vice president, second place in the election, making him Adams' constitutional subordinate and political rival simultaneously. The arrangement was absurd, unstable, guaranteed to produce conflict. Adams had won by 3 electoral votes, 71 to 68. It was the narrowest possible victory, a mandate from no one, a presidency born in division. Half the country had voted for Jefferson, half had voted for Adams, though many Federalists preferred almost anyone else. He was president because he was the least objectionable option, not because he was wanted. The cabinet he inherited made everything worse. Washington's department heads remained in office. Timothy Pickering as Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott as Treasury Secretary, James McHenry as War Secretary. Adams kept them, thinking continuity would aid the transition. What he didn't realize, or chose not to see, was that these men were loyal not to him, but to Alexander Hamilton, the former Treasury Secretary, who still pulled Federalist strings from New York. Hamilton despised Adams. He found him vain, stubborn, too independent, insufficiently committed to Federalist economic policies. Hamilton wanted a president he could control, a figurehead who would implement Hamilton's vision while Hamilton operated from behind the scenes. Adams was many things, but controllable was not among them. The crisis came from France. The French revolutionary government, angered by American neutrality and the Jay Treaty with Britain, began seizing American merchant ships. Hundreds of vessels were captured, their cargoes confiscated, their crews imprisoned. American shipping faced ruin. National honor demanded response. Adams sent a diplomatic mission to Paris to negotiate peace. In October 1797, the American envoys met with French officials who demanded bribes before negotiations could even begin. $250,000 to begin talking, plus a massive loan to France. The Americans refused. The French refused to negotiate. The mission collapsed. When news of the XYZ affair, named for the anonymous French agents who demanded bribes, reached America in April 1798, the country exploded in fury. The insult to American honor was intolerable. Across the nation, the cry went up: war with France. The high Federalists in Congress, Hamilton's followers, saw their opportunity. War would unite the country, discredit the pro-French Republicans, allow expansion of the army and navy, cement Federalist power. Adams was caught in the storm. Personally, he was furious at French contempt for American dignity. Politically, he understood that war was the path to popularity. A successful war would vindicate his presidency, silence his critics, ensure re-election. The pressure was enormous, from his cabinet, from Congress, from newspapers, from the public. But Adams looked at war and saw catastrophe. America had no real navy, no army worth the name, no money to fund a prolonged conflict. France was the most powerful military force in Europe. War would mean years of fighting, massive debt, possible defeat, definite suffering. And for what? National pride, Federalist political advantage. While he prepared for war, building up the navy, fortifying ports, creating a provisional army, he never stopped working for peace. He sent another diplomatic mission to France, this time with clear instructions: negotiate, but pay no bribes, make no shameful concessions. If France wanted peace, France would negotiate honestly or not at all. His own party saw this as weakness, possibly treachery. Hamilton wanted war. The Federalist press wanted war. Congress wanted war. But Adams wanted peace, even if peace cost him everything. Meanwhile, the Federalist Congress, riding the wave of anti-French hysteria, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in the summer of 1798. The Alien Acts gave the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous. The Sedition Act criminalized, quote, against the government. Adams signed them. It was his greatest failure, the stain on his presidency that would never wash clean. The Sedition Act was used to prosecute Republican newspaper editors, critics of Federalist policies, anyone who spoke too loudly against the government. It was precisely the kind of tyrannical suppression of speech Adams had spent his career opposing. That he signed it, enforced it, defended it. This was indefensible. His reasoning was fear that Republican criticism was undermining the government during crisis, that pro-French agitation was close to sedition, that the nation was too fragile to withstand unrestricted attacks on its institutions. The reasoning was wrong. The acts were wrong. Adams knew it even as he defended them, and history would judge him harshly. But while he was failing on civil liberties, he was succeeding on the question that mattered most. In February 1799, Adams nominated William Vans Murray as minister to France, restarting peace negotiations. His cabinet was horrified. They tried to block the nomination, to delay the mission, to sabotage the peace process. Adams overruled them all. Hamilton wrote letters, gave speeches, denounced Adams as weak, foolish, unfit for office. The Federalist press turned on their own president. Adams' cabinet members conspired against him, reporting his decisions to Hamilton, undermining his authority. The party was splitting, and Adams was choosing peace over party unity. In October 1800, the American mission in Paris concluded a treaty with France. The Convention of 1800 ended the Quasi-War, restored diplomatic relations, avoided the catastrophe of full-scale conflict. Adams had succeeded. He had kept America out of war, preserved the nation's independence, proven that a republic could resist the temptation to choose popularity over principle. It cost him everything. The election of 1800 was vicious beyond anything America had seen. Jefferson's Republicans attacked Adams as a monarchist, a warmonger, a man who had betrayed Republican principles with the Sedition Acts. Hamilton's Federalists attacked Adams as weak, foolish, too independent for party leadership. Hamilton even published a pamphlet, meant for private circulation but leaked publicly, savaging Adams' character, judgment, and fitness for office. Adams barely campaigned. He remained at the new capital city of Washington, working, brooding, watching his presidency collapse around him. When the electoral votes were counted, Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied at 73 votes each. Adams received 65. He had lost, rejected by his country after 4 years of service that had cost him his party, his reputation, his peace of mind. In his final weeks as president, Adams made appointments, dozens of them, filling judicial positions with Federalists, the famous midnight judges, appointed in the last hours before Jefferson's inauguration. It was partisan, spiteful, a final assertion of Federalist power before losing control. Adams was human enough to want revenge, even small revenge. On March 4th, 1801, Inauguration Day, Adams was not present. He left Washington before dawn, unable to face attending Jefferson's triumph. It was petty, ungracious, unworthy of the principles he claimed to embody. He knew it. He left anyway. The ride back to Massachusetts was long and bitter. He had been president for 4 years. He had avoided war, preserved the nation, upheld what he believed was right. And for his trouble, he had been rejected, vilified, abandoned by his own party, defeated by the man who had been his friend. The question that would haunt him for years was whether he had chosen correctly. The sedition acts were wrong. He knew that, would come to regret it deeply. But the peace with France, that had been right, necessary, worth the cost in popularity and power. He believed it, even in defeat. He had to believe it. Because if he was wrong, if he had sacrificed his presidency for nothing, then what had the last 4 years meant? And what had any of it meant? History would eventually vindicate his choice for peace. But vindication came too late to matter. In March 1801, riding home in disgrace, John Adams knew only that he had done his duty and been punished for it, had chosen principle over popularity and lost everything, had been right in the way that ensures you die unappreciated and alone. It was, he thought bitterly, the story of his entire life. Peacefield. The name itself was ironic. John Adams returned to his Quincy farm in March 1801, seeking peace and finding none. The house sat on a hill overlooking Massachusetts Bay, 80 acres of rocky New England soil, the same land he had inherited from his father and sworn he would never farm. Now it was his prison and his refuge, the place where he would live out however many years remained, forgotten by the nation he had helped create. He was 65 years old. He had served his country for a quarter century, Continental Congress, European diplomacy, vice presidency, presidency, and it had ended in humiliation, rejected by the voters, betrayed by his own party, abandoned by men he had considered allies. The bitterness was overwhelming, corrosive, inescapable. The worst betrayal was Hamilton's. Adams could accept losing to Jefferson. Political rivals, philosophical differences, at least that made sense. But Hamilton was supposed to be a Federalist, supposedly committed to the same constitutional principles, the same vision of strong central government. Instead, Hamilton had sabotaged him, published that damned pamphlet attacking his character, split the Federalist Party, ensured Adams' defeat out of pure spite and ambition. Adams could not let it go. The betrayal festered, consumed him, filled page after page of his correspondence. Hamilton this, Hamilton that. The man was dead by 1804, killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, but Adams kept attacking his memory, refighting battles that were already lost, trying to convince anyone who would listen that he had been right and Hamilton wrong. He read obsessively. His library at Peacefield grew to thousands of volumes. Ancient history, political philosophy, theology, science, anything he could acquire. He read Cicero and Tacitus, trying to find parallels to his own experience in the fall of the Roman Republic. He read political theorists, searching for validation of his ideas about balanced government and institutional checks on power. He annotated margins, argued with authors dead for centuries, built elaborate intellectual justifications for his decisions. In 1802, he began writing his autobiography. It should have been a thoughtful reflection on a life of service. Instead, it became a defensive brief, angry and self-justifying, refighting old arguments, settling old scores. He wrote about the Continental Congress, about his European missions, about his presidency, all filtered through the lens of grievance. Look what I did. Look what I sacrificed. Look how they repaid me. He never finished it. The project collapsed under the weight of its own bitterness, abandoned after covering only the revolutionary period, leaving the presidency, the part that hurt most, unexamined and unexplained. Abigail held things together, as she always had. She managed the farm with the same competence she had shown during his long European absences. She kept the accounts, supervised the workers, made sure they had income from crops and rents. She managed his moods, knowing when to engage his complaints and when to let them exhaust themselves unheard. She was his anchor, the one person who knew him completely and stayed anyway. But even Abigail couldn't fix everything. Their children bore the scars of having John Adams as a father, the impossible expectations, the constant criticism, the sense that nothing they did was ever quite good enough. John Quincy had succeeded, more or less. He was building a political career, served as senator, would later be minister to Russia, Secretary of State, eventually president himself. But his success was shadowed by his father's demanding presence. The weight of being an Adams, the burden of living up to a legacy of service and sacrifice. Charles had failed spectacularly. Alcoholism destroyed him, killed him at 30 in 1800, just before Adams left the presidency. Adams grieved but also judged, saw Charles's failure as moral weakness, inability to master the self-discipline Adams prized above all. The grief mixed with disappointment, creating a wound that never healed. Thomas struggled, never quite finding his place, never quite measuring up, living in the shadow of his father and brother. He managed the farm, lived nearby, did his duty without distinction or disaster. For an Adams, that counted as failure. The slow realization that crept over Adams in those early retirement years was unbearable. He would die forgotten. The nation he had helped birth had moved on without him. Washington was revered as the father of the country. Jefferson was celebrated as the author of the Declaration and the champion of democracy. Franklin was beloved as the wise sage. Hamilton, even dead, was remembered as the architect of American finance. And Adams? Adams was the difficult one, the one-term president defeated in humiliation, the man who had signed the hated Sedition Acts, the Federalist relic from a partisan era best forgotten. His warnings about democracy's dangers were ignored. His constitutional theories were dismissed as pessimistic and elitist. His sacrifices were unremembered. The depression that settled over him mixed uneasily with defiance. He was right, damn it, about balanced government, about the dangers of faction, about avoiding war with France, about the need for institutional checks on popular passion. History would prove him right, even if the present refused to see it. He wrote letters to old friends and colleagues, trying to explain himself, to set the record straight, to make them understand. He wrote to Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician who had signed the Declaration with him. He wrote to old congressional colleagues. He wrote defensive, rambling letters that tried to justify decisions made years ago, arguing cases already decided, appealing verdicts already rendered. The isolation was near complete. His political career was over. No one would appoint a bitter 65-year-old former president to anything. His legal career was long abandoned. His farm was a gentleman's hobby, not a real occupation. He had his books, his family, his grievances. That was all. Days passed in routine. Rise early, read, write letters, argue with books, take walks around the farm, read more, go to bed still thinking about everything he'd done right that had gone unappreciated. Weeks became months. Months became years. The nation he had helped create continued without him, indifferent to his existence. He told himself it didn't matter. Service was its own reward. He had done his duty. Popularity was fleeting. History would judge. All the platitudes he'd been telling himself his entire life, trying to believe them, never quite succeeding. Abigail watched him spiral, pulled him back when she could, let him work through it when she couldn't. She knew him too well to try to talk him out of his bitterness. It was part of him, woven through his character like a fault line through rock. You could work around it, but never remove it. Then in 1809, 8 years into his exile, a letter arrived from Virginia. Benjamin Rush had been corresponding with both Adams and Jefferson separately, working quietly to reconcile the two old friends. Rush believed their estrangement was tragic, unnecessary, harmful to both men. He played mediator, suggesting to each that the other missed them, preparing the ground for reconciliation. Jefferson had written to Rush, mentioning Adams fondly, wondering if reconciliation might be possible. Rush forwarded the sentiment to Adams. Would Adams consider writing to Jefferson? Would he be willing to let the old wounds heal? Adams read Rush's letter in his Quincy study, Abigail nearby. The suggestion hung in the air between them. Reach out to Jefferson. End the silence. Admit that maybe, just maybe, the grudge wasn't worth maintaining. Part of him resisted. Jefferson had defeated him, taken everything, represented the democratic impulses Adams distrusted. But another part, older, tired, increasingly aware of mortality, recognized what Rush was offering. Not vindication, not victory, just connection. Someone who remembered, who had been there, who understood what it had cost. Abigail said nothing, waiting. The decision had to be his. Adams picked up his pen. Perhaps there was something beyond bitterness after all. Perhaps the story wasn't over yet. Benjamin Rush had been working toward this for years. The Philadelphia physician, signer of the Declaration, friend to both men, could not bear watching Adams and Jefferson waste their final years in estrangement. He wrote to each separately, gentle letters mentioning the other fondly, suggesting that the old friendship might be worth salvaging, planting seeds, and waiting for them to take root. By 1811, both men were ready, though neither would make the first move. Adams was 76, Jefferson 68. Too old for pride, Rush thought, though he knew Adams better than that. Pride was never something Adams outgrew. It simply became more complicated, mixed with loneliness and the awareness that the other men who had been there at the beginning were nearly all dead. Adams broke first. On January 1st, 1812, he sat at his desk in Quincy and wrote a brief note to Monticello. No apologies, no grand gestures, just a letter mentioning that he was sending Jefferson 2 volumes of lectures on rhetoric and hoping his old friend was well. Brief, almost casual, as if they had corresponded just last week, rather than having maintained hostile silence for 12 years. Jefferson's response came quickly, warm, welcoming, eager. He had hoped for this, he wrote. He remembered their friendship with pleasure. The past was past. They were old men now. Why waste what time remained in bitterness? The flood followed. Over the next 14 years, they would write 158 letters, creating one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. They wrote about everything: philosophy, history, linguistics, agriculture, science, religion, their grandchildren, their aching bodies, books they were reading, ideas they were considering. What they mostly avoided was politics. the partisan battles of the 1790s, the presidential campaign of 1800, the mutual wounds. These remained largely unexamined. By unspoken agreement, they stepped around painful subjects, choosing instead to reconnect over ideas and memories, finding their way back to the friendship that had existed before ambition pulled them apart. They wrote as equals, which was new. During the Revolution, there had always been hierarchy. Adams older, more experienced, more certain. Jefferson the younger man, the better writer, the more graceful politician. Now age had reduced them both, stripped away pretense, left them just two old men trying to make sense of what they had lived through. The differences that had divided them remained. Jefferson's letters radiated optimism about human nature, faith in progress, conviction that democracy would perfect itself through education and reason. Adams' letters countered with skepticism. Human nature was unchanging. Passion would always threaten reason. Democracy required constant vigilance, or it would collapse into tyranny. After 50 years, they were still arguing the same fundamental questions, but now the arguments had affection woven through them, a recognition that disagreement didn't require enmity, that two intelligent men could see the world differently and both be partly right. Jefferson wrote about his university, the University of Virginia, his great project for educating free citizens in the arts of liberty. Adams wrote back with encouragement mixed with doubt. Yes, education was vital, but did Jefferson really think it would cure human selfishness? Jefferson insisted it would. Adams remained unconvinced but charmed by Jefferson's unshakable optimism. They wrote about religion, where their differences were stark. Jefferson had created his own Bible, removing all miracles, leaving only Jesus' moral teachings. Adams found this simultaneously admirable and absurd. Why not just admit you were a deist? But he appreciated Jefferson's independence of mind, his refusal to accept doctrine without examination. In intimate moments, walls came down. Adams admitted his loneliness, the isolation of his final years, the sense that the world had moved on and forgotten him. Jefferson confessed his fears about the future, not his own, which was nearly over, but America's. Would the nation survive? Would slavery destroy it? Would faction tear apart what the Revolution had built? Most powerfully, they shared the awareness that they were the last ones left. Washington dead in 1799, Hamilton in 1804, Franklin long gone, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, so many others, all departed. Only Jefferson and Adams remained from that first circle of founders, the men who had argued America into existence in stuffy Philadelphia rooms while summer heat made thinking difficult and independence seemed impossible. You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other, Adams wrote. It captured what the correspondence meant. Not justification or vindication, but explanation, understanding. The human need to be known by someone who comprehends what you experienced because they experienced it too. Jefferson wrote about his daughters, his grandchildren, the small satisfactions of farming and reading. Adams wrote about John Quincy's career, about Abigail's health, about books that had moved him. They wrote about Cicero and Tacitus, about ancient republics and modern experiments, about whether classical learning was still relevant or obsolete affectation. The letters became a conversation across distance, across ideology, across the wounds of the past. They wrote not to convince each other, Both were too old and stubborn for that, but to connect, to maintain contact with the one person who remembered, who had been there, who understood. Sometimes the old bitterness surfaced. Adams would make a cutting remark about the Democratic Republican press, or Jefferson would defend positions Adams saw as dangerously naive. But they had learned, finally, to let those moments pass, to not pursue every argument to its conclusion, to preserve the friendship rather than win the point. The equality of old age was the great revelation. Jefferson no longer seemed the graceful aristocrat who made Adams feel provincial. Adams no longer seemed the difficult scold who made Jefferson feel judged. They were just two old men, bodies failing, minds still sharp, trying to understand what their lives had meant and whether the American experiment they had launched would survive them. In one letter, Jefferson wrote, "It is a good world on the whole, and I steer my bark with a hope, leaving fear astern." Pure Jefferson, optimistic, forward-looking, refusing to dwell on difficulties. Adams replied with characteristic skepticism, "I admire your navigation and should like to sail with you, but I own there are breakers ahead and rocks and shoals." Yet even in disagreement, there was affection. The grace of forgiveness had come not through grand gestures, but through accumulated letters, through years of conversation that slowly rebuilt what faction had destroyed. They never directly addressed the presidential campaign of 1800, never explicitly forgave each other for the attacks. They simply chose to move past it, to value the friendship more than the grudges, to recognize that they needed each other in these final years. By 1826, both men knew the end was approaching. Jefferson, at 83, was increasingly frail. Adams, at 90, was blind in one eye, shaky, finding it difficult to write. Their correspondence slowed, but never quite stopped. What they had found was not reconciliation in the sense of resolving their differences. Those remained, would always remain. What they had found was something rarer, the ability to hold differences while maintaining connection, to disagree fundamentally while still respecting and even loving each other. They had learned what perhaps only age could teach, that being right mattered less than being human, that the need for understanding outweighed the need for vindication, that friendship between imperfect men was possible and precious precisely because of their imperfections. The reconciliation was not perfect, but it was real. And in those final years, writing letters across the distance between Massachusetts and Virginia, two old revolutionaries found something they had lost in the battles of earlier decades. Not youth, not certainty, not victory, but each other. That, in the end, was enough. October 28th, 1818. Abigail Adams died in the upstairs bedroom at Peacefield, with John holding her hand. Typhoid fever had taken her quickly, 2 weeks from first symptoms to death. She was 73 years old. They had been married for 54 years. The grief was annihilating. John had survived political defeat, public humiliation, the death of children. But Abigail had been there through all of it, his anchor, his balance wheel, the person who knew him completely and stayed anyway. Without her, the house felt empty, cavernous, haunted by 50 years of shared life now ended. He wandered the rooms like a ghost himself. Her writing desk still held letters half finished. Her chair sat empty by the fire. The bedroom, where she died, became a shrine he could barely enter. Friends wrote condolences. He barely responded. What was there to say? Half of himself had been torn away, the half that had made the other half bearable. For weeks, he could not write, could barely eat. John Quincy came from Boston, worried his father might simply give up, stop fighting, let grief finish what age had begun. But slowly, painfully, Adams found his way back to some semblance of function. Not life, that seemed too grand a word for what remained, but existence, routine, the habits that carry us forward when purpose fails. He was 83 years old. His body was failing in stages, piece by piece. His hands trembled constantly now, making writing difficult. His eyesight dimmed, one eye nearly blind, the other struggling. His hearing faded, making conversation exhausting. He shuffled when he walked, supporting himself with a cane, each step requiring thought and effort. But his mind remained sharp, cruelly so. He was trapped in failing flesh, watching his body betray him while his thoughts remained clear and merciless. He read still, though holding books was difficult, and the print swam before his damaged eyes. He wrote letters, though his handwriting had become nearly illegible, the trembling hand producing scrawls that embarrassed him. Something unexpected happened as he declined. Respect grew. A younger generation, born after the revolution, began rediscovering the founders, asking what those men had been like, what they had believed, how they had created a nation from nothing but ideas and will. Visitors came to Peacefield, young politicians, historians, admirers who wanted to meet the last living link to 1776. Adams received them, sometimes graciously, sometimes with the blunt honesty that had always been his hallmark. He told stories, answered questions, corrected misconceptions. He was history itself now, a living artifact, the last man who could say, "I was there," about events receding into mythology. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to America for a grand tour, celebrating the Revolutionary Alliance 50 years later. Lafayette was 67, Adams 88. They had not seen each other in decades. When Lafayette's tour reached Boston, he made the pilgrimage to Quincy to visit his old friend. The meeting was bittersweet. Two old revolutionaries, both knowing they were relics, remnants of an era that seemed increasingly distant and mythologized. They sat in Adams' parlor, Lafayette still graceful despite age, Adams bent and trembling, and talked about old battles, old friends, the world they had made and the world that had replaced it. Lafayette spoke of France, of how the revolutionary ideals they had shared had played out differently there. Blood and terror and Napoleon and restoration. Adams listened, nodding, unsurprised. He had always warned that revolution unleashed forces hard to control, that destroying old structures was easier than building new ones. But there was joy in the meeting too. They had survived. The experiment had worked. At least in America, the republic they had fought for still stood, growing, expanding, becoming something neither could have imagined. That counted for something, even if both men felt half forgotten by the nation they had helped create. Then came the vindication Adams had waited for his entire life, though it came too late to fully savor. In 1824, John Quincy Adams was elected President of the United States, the son following the father into the highest office, validating everything John Adams Sr. had sacrificed, suffered, endured. Adams' pride was immense but complicated by worry. He knew what the presidency cost: reputation, peace, health, happiness. He had warned John Quincy, tried to prepare him for the isolation and the attacks and the impossible burden of the office. But John Quincy had his father's stubbornness, his sense of duty, his inability to refuse when called. On Inauguration Day, 1825, Adams sat in Quincy, too weak to travel to Washington, imagining his son taking the oath. Pride and fear warred in his chest. He had lived to see vindication, and Adams president again, the family name redeemed. But he also knew his son was about to enter the same hell that had consumed his own presidency, the same partisan warfare and impossible expectations. The satisfaction was real but incomplete. He had wanted this, yes, but now, at the end, he wondered whether it was a blessing or a curse, whether he had prepared his son for greatness or condemned him to suffering. As 1826 began, everyone knew the 50th anniversary of independence was approaching. Invitations arrived, asking Adams to attend celebrations in Boston, in Washington, in towns across Massachusetts. He declined them all. His body would not permit the travel. Even the short journey to Boston was beyond him now. His final written communication about the anniversary captured everything about him: the pride, the stubbornness, the devotion to the cause that had defined his life. Unable to attend a July 4th celebration, he sent a brief toast. "I will give you independence forever." 7 words, no qualification, no hesitation, no doubt. Independence forever. It was his final public statement, his last message to the nation he'd helped create. After everything, the doubts, the defeats, the humiliations, the feeling of being forgotten, he still believed, still insisted, still declared that independence, that great gamble he had pushed for in 1776, was worth everything it had cost. By late June, he was bedridden. The decline accelerated. Days blurred together. He surfaced occasionally into lucidity, recognized family members, spoke a few words, then sank back into semi-consciousness. His children and grandchildren gathered, knowing the end was near, waiting. The bitterness that had consumed him after leaving the presidency had faded, worn away by age and loss and the slow accumulation of years. He had outlived his enemies. Hamilton dead, the Federalist Party dead, the partisan battles that had destroyed his presidency, now historical curiosities. He had outlived most of his friends too, leaving him alone with memories and the stubborn refusal to die before he was ready. But something like peace had come, finally. Not the peace of resolution. He still believed he had been right about everything, would die believing it. But the peace of acceptance, of recognizing that his story was ending, that the judgment he had craved would come from history, not contemporaries, and that he could do nothing now but let go. The house at Peacefield was quiet in those final days. Summer heat settled over Massachusetts. Outside, preparations began for the 50th anniversary celebration. Inside, John Adams lay dying, waiting for something. Though whether for death or independence, day or some final clarity, no one could say. His mind drifted between past and present, between memories of 1776 and awareness of 1826. The body had failed, but consciousness remained, trapped in flesh that no longer obeyed, waiting for release that would come soon now, very soon. Independence forever. His last message, his final promise, his testament. Whatever else history decided about John Adams, it could not deny that he had meant every word. July 1st. The bedroom upstairs at Peacefield was dim despite the summer afternoon, curtains drawn against the heat. John Adams lay motionless in the bed, breathing shallow and irregular. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor. His eyes remained closed. The family gathered downstairs, speaking in hushed voices, knowing. His son John Quincy had arrived from Washington. Thomas was there, and Nabby's children, and servants who had been with the family for years. They took turns sitting with him, watching for signs, a flutter of eyelids, a movement of lips, some indication that he was still present behind the failing flesh. The decline had accelerated over the past week. Adams had stopped eating days ago, could barely swallow water. His pulse was weak and erratic. The doctor had been called and offered no hope. By all medical logic, he should have died already. Yet he continued, breath after ragged breath, as if waiting for something, holding on through sheer stubborn will to reach some finish line only he could see. July 2nd passed in the same slow agony. Adams surfaced occasionally into semi-consciousness. His lips moved, forming words no one could hear. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused, seeing something not in the room. Then he would sink back into darkness, chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, the body persisting while the mind wandered elsewhere. The family maintained their vigil. They sat with him in shifts, reading aloud sometimes, though they weren't sure he could hear. They spoke to him, telling him it was all right to let go, that he had earned his rest. The platitudes people say to the dying, hoping for permission to release each other. July 3rd. Morning brought no change except that Adams seemed more agitated. His breathing grew louder, more labored. His hands moved restlessly on the coverlet. His mouth worked as if trying to speak. John Quincy leaned close, trying to catch the words, but they were fragments, disconnected syllables. Around noon, Adams spoke clearly for the first time in days. Thomas Jefferson. Just the name, clear enough that everyone in the room heard it. Then he lapsed back into silence. What was he seeing? Where was his mind? Perhaps he was back in Philadelphia in 1776, standing before Congress, arguing for independence while Jefferson sat nearby, writing the words that would justify what they were about to do. Perhaps in Paris, wishing his friend were there to help navigate French politics. Perhaps simply remembering 50 years of friendship and rivalry and reconciliation, 50 years of arguing about human nature and democracy and the meaning of the revolution they had made together. Night fell on July 3rd. Outside, preparations for the next day's celebration continued. Workers hung bunting, arranged platforms for speakers, prepared fireworks. 50 years of independence. The nation was planning the greatest celebration in its history, unaware that upstairs in a Quincy farmhouse, one of the last men who had made independence possible was dying. July 4th. Morning. Cannon fire began early, celebrating the anniversary. The booms echoed across Quincy Bay, up the hill to Peacefield, through the windows of the death room. Did Adams hear them? Did some part of his failing consciousness register the sound and understand? His granddaughter Susanna sat beside the bed, holding his hand. It was cold, the skin papery thin, the pulse barely perceptible. She thought he was gone, then saw his chest rise slightly, pause, rise again, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. Around noon, his breathing changed. The ragged gasps became shallower, faster. His eyes opened briefly, clouded, unfocused, seeing nothing in the room, but perhaps something beyond it. His lips moved. The family gathered. This was it. Finally, they leaned close, straining to hear. Quote, 1. The words were barely audible, a whisper requiring enormous effort, but they were clear enough. His last coherent thought, expressed with his last strength, was about his friend and rival, the man he had spent 50 years arguing with, fighting against, reconciling with, trying to understand and be understood by. Thomas Jefferson survives, a statement of fact as Adams understood it, a comfort, perhaps, that he was not the last, that someone who had been there would remain to remember, or perhaps a final moment of their endless competition, Jefferson outlasting him even in death. No one knows what Adams meant. The words hang in history, mysterious, poignant, impossible to fully decode. What Adams did not know, could not know, was that 500 miles south at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had died that morning. Jefferson's last words had been about survival too, asking if it was the 4th yet, wanting to live to see the anniversary. He had made it, barely, dying just after noon on July 4th, 1826. At Peacefield, the afternoon stretched into evening. Adams's breathing grew slower, more irregular. Long pauses between breaths, each one seemingly the last. Then another would come. Outside, the celebrations intensified. Music, speeches, fireworks beginning as twilight fell. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, as the sun set and fireworks burst over Quincy Bay, John Adams breathed his last. There was no drama, no final words, no struggle, just a breath, and then no breath, and then the stillness that is different from sleep, the absolute absence that is death. The news spread slowly. Adams dead on July 4th. The second president, one of the last founders, gone on the 50th anniversary of independence. Remarkable, people said. Fitting, as if he had held on deliberately, willing himself to survive until the day that meant everything to him. Then came the second wave of news, traveling from Virginia. Jefferson was dead too, died the same day, the same July 4th, 50 years after the Declaration. The nation received the news with stunned awe. Both men gone on the same day, both last surviving signers of the Declaration, both architects of independence, dying together on its 50th anniversary. It seemed impossible, supernatural, providential. God himself must have arranged it, people said, the hand of Providence orchestrating their simultaneous departure. Or was it simply will? Both men knowing the anniversary approached, both holding on because giving up before July 4th would have been a failure they could not accept. Adams certainly had that kind of stubbornness. Jefferson had his own form of determination. Or pure coincidence, random chance producing the kind of symmetry that humans cannot help but interpret as meaningful, even when meaning might be nothing but pattern-seeking instinct applied to chaos. The question cannot be answered. We are left with the fact, stunning in its symmetry. July 4th, 1826. Jefferson dead at Monticello around noon. Adams dead at Peacefield around 6 p.m. Both men believing the other survived. Both men making it to the anniversary. Both men leaving together, as they had begun together 50 years before. In the bedroom at Peacefield, John Adams lay still. His struggle finally ended. Outside, fireworks continued, celebrating independence, unaware that one of its primary architects had just departed. The celebration and the death proceeded simultaneously, the nation's birthday and the founder's death inextricably linked. Thomas Jefferson survives, his last words uttered in the belief that his old friend still lived, that someone who remembered would carry the story forward. He was wrong about the survival, but perhaps right about what mattered. The ideas survived, the nation survived, independence survived, as he had promised it would, forever. The cosmic coincidence of their deaths would be interpreted 1,000 ways: divine plan, historical poetry, random chance given meaning by human need for pattern. Perhaps all of those, perhaps none. What remains here is simply what happened. Two old revolutionaries, friends and rivals, dying on the same impossible day, 50 years after the beginning, leaving together as if the story required them both, could not end one without ending the other. The 4th of July would never be quite the same. Celebration and mourning, birth and death, forever intertwined in American memory. The symmetry too perfect to be accident, too strange to fully explain. John Adams was gone, but independence, as he had promised, survived forever. The eulogies began immediately. Orations in Boston, in Washington, in towns across America mourning the passing of the founders. But even in death, the old inequalities persisted. Jefferson was celebrated as the author of the Declaration, the apostle of democracy, the philosopher-statesman whose words had defined American ideals. Adams was mentioned, of course. He had been there too, had done important things. But the praise was dutiful, obligatory, lacking the warmth and reverence lavished on Jefferson. Daniel Webster delivered a famous eulogy celebrating both men, but even Webster's careful balance could not hide which founder captured the imagination. Jefferson's words lived on, quoted and requoted. Adams's contributions were acknowledged, but felt somehow technical, procedural, less inspiring than Jefferson's soaring rhetoric about equality and natural rights. Through the 19th century, Adams's reputation continued its slow fade into obscurity. History books mentioned him, second president, fought for independence, served as diplomat, but always in Washington's shadow, in Jefferson's shadow, even in Franklin's shadow. He became a footnote, the difficult founder, the one-term president remembered mainly for the Alien and Sedition Acts, for leaving Washington before Jefferson's inauguration, for being surpassed by his own son. The reasons were clear. Adams had left no monument of words like the Declaration. He had built no movement like Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. He had not commanded armies like Washington or charmed Europe like Franklin. His defense of the constitutions gathered dust in libraries, unread, too dense for popular consumption. His diary and letters remained unpublished, locked away in family archives. His warnings about democracy, that it required virtue and institutional restraint, that pure majority rule could become tyranny, that faction posed constant threats, sounded elitist to a nation embracing Jacksonian democracy. His pessimism about human nature seemed contrary to American optimism. His very complexity worked against him in an age that preferred its founders simple and heroic. The Adams family fought against the forgetting. John Quincy worked to preserve his father's papers. Charles Francis Adams, John's grandson, spent years editing and publishing the massive collection of letters and diaries. But scholarly publication was not popular redemption. The early 20th century brought the first stirrings of reassessment. Historians began reading Adams's actual writings rather than relying on second-hand accounts. they discovered a thinker more sophisticated than the caricature, a politician more principled than his reputation suggested. His warnings about democracy's fragility seemed prescient in an age of populist demagogues. His insistence on institutional checks and balances looked like wisdom rather than elitism. But serious rehabilitation required someone to make Adams live again, to rescue him from the footnotes and restore him to human complexity. That champion arrived in the form of historians like Page Smith and later David McCullough, who saw in Adams a story worth telling, not of a perfect founder, but of a profoundly human one, flawed and brilliant, vain and principled, difficult and necessary. McCullough's 2001 biography became a bestseller, introducing Adams to millions. Here was a founder you could actually imagine meeting, anxious, insecure, desperately wanting recognition while doing things that guaranteed he wouldn't get it. A man who defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, who avoided war with France when war was popular, who lost re-election and left Washington in a fit of pique, who reconciled with his greatest rival in old age and died whispering Jefferson's name. The HBO miniseries in 2008 completed Adams's popular resurrection. Millions watched Paul Giamatti portray Adams as neither marble saint nor cartoon villain, but as a recognizable human being, brilliant but insecure, principled but vain, doing his best in impossible circumstances and usually paying the price for it. Modern understanding of Adams has become more nuanced, more appreciative. He is seen now as the necessary skeptic, the Republican conscience, the founder who understood that democracy was hard work requiring constant vigilance. His pessimism about human nature looks like realism rather than elitism. His warnings about faction and demagoguery resonate in an age of polarization and populism. His flaws, once damning, now humanize him. The vanity and insecurity make him relatable. The alien and sedition acts remain indefensible, but understanding them in context, fear during quasi-war with France, concern about national fragility, makes them comprehensible, if not excusable. His inability to compromise principle for popularity now seems admirable in an age cynical about political expedience. The partnership with Abigail has been elevated to central importance. Their correspondence reveals an intellectual and emotional equality rare for the era. Abigail's intelligence, her political acumen, her influence on John's thinking, all recognized now as essential to understanding both of them. Their marriage becomes an early argument for women's capabilities, for partnership over patriarchy. Adams' influence traces through American history in ways his contemporaries did not recognize. His writings on balanced government, on separation of powers and institutional checks, influenced constitutional thinking. His skepticism about human nature became a strain of American conservatism. The belief that institutions matter more than intentions, that liberty requires architecture, not just aspiration. His presidency set precedents still relevant. Peaceful transfer of power after electoral defeat established that elections decided who governed. His refusal to go to war despite political pressure established that presidents could resist popular demands when they believed those demands were wrong. His appointment of John Marshall as Chief Justice shaped American constitutional law for decades. Modern debates about Adams center on questions still unresolved. How much executive power is too much? When does security threaten liberty? How do we balance majority will with minority rights? What is the cost of principle versus the temptation of popularity? These were Adams' questions, and they remain ours. The Alien and Sedition Acts particularly haunt contemporary discussions. Adams' greatest failure, using federal power to suppress dissent, serves as warning about what fear can make leaders do, how security concerns can justify curtailing freedom. Every expansion of executive power in crisis, every restriction of speech in wartime. Adams' failure provides the cautionary example, but his courage in avoiding war with France provides the counterexample. Leadership that chooses right over popular, that sacrifices political future for national interest. In an age of endless wars, Adams' decision for peace over war looks increasingly wise. The resurrection of John Adams' reputation raises a fundamental question. How do we judge flawed founders? Do we condemn them for failing to transcend their era's prejudices? Do we celebrate them for exceeding contemporary standards even slightly? Do we hold them to absolute moral standards or historical context? Adams provides no easy answer because he contains contradictions impossible to resolve. He defended liberty while signing the Sedition Acts. He believed in equality while accepting slavery's existence. He championed women's education while denying them political rights. He was both right and wrong, both admirable and flawed, both essential and problematic. Perhaps that is his ultimate legacy, forcing us to grapple with complexity, to resist the temptation to make founders into simple heroes or villains, to understand that humans contain multitudes, that service and failure can coexist in the same person. John Adams would appreciate that assessment, even as he would insist one more time that he was right about everything important. He would be insufferable about his vindication, writing long letters explaining how history had finally recognized his wisdom. And then Abigail would raise that eyebrow, and he would laugh despite himself and admit that perhaps, just perhaps, being remembered as human was enough. Return to the beginning. A hot July afternoon in 1826. A bedroom in Quincy. An old man dying. His last words. Thomas Jefferson survives. The moment contains everything. 50 years of friendship and rivalry, collaboration and competition, mutual respect and mutual frustration, all compressed into 3 words uttered with final breath. What does that moment reveal? That even at the end, Adams could not escape Jefferson, could not stop measuring himself against the man who had been his complement and his opposite. That rivalry and respect are not opposites, but 2 faces of the same deep connection. That the last thought of a difficult, brilliant, impossible man was not about himself, but about the one person who had shared the burden of creating a nation from nothing but words and will. The central paradox of John Adams was this: vanity and virtue coexisting in the same heart. He craved recognition desperately, filled his diary with complaints about being overlooked, could not bear to be second best. And yet he made choices guaranteed to cost him popularity, defending British soldiers, avoiding war with France, refusing to play the political games that might have secured re-election. He was vain enough to believe he deserved greatness and virtuous enough to sacrifice it for principle. Most people resolve this tension one way or the other. Adams chose both and neither, tormented by wanting what his own choices made impossible, unable to be the kind of man who stopped caring about being appreciated even as he did things that guaranteed he wouldn't be. His greatest fear was being forgotten. He wrote about it obsessively, worried about it constantly, imagined his reputation fading while others, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, were remembered and celebrated. And his fear came true. For more than a century, Adams was largely forgotten, overshadowed, reduced to footnote. The nightmare he had dreaded materialized after his death. But then, impossibly, resurrection. The forgotten founder rediscovered, his papers finally read, his life finally understood in its full complexity. The vindication came too late for him to enjoy, but it came. History remembered after all. His greatest achievement was not any single act, but sustained integrity across a lifetime of service. He defended British soldiers when Boston wanted blood. He pushed for independence when reconciliation was still possible. He avoided war when war was popular. He reconciled with Jefferson when pride might have kept them apart. Over and over, he chose what he believed was right over what would have been easy or popular or politically advantageous. What he got right resonates across centuries. The need for institutional checks on power, his insight that good intentions are not enough, that liberty requires architecture, that passion must be constrained by law and procedure. The dangers of demagoguery, his understanding that democracy is fragile, that faction threatens it, that leaders can manipulate popular emotion toward tyranny. The value of law over passion, his certainty that facts matter more than feelings, that justice requires evidence rather than mob emotion. What he got wrong is equally clear. The Alien and Sedition Acts were indefensible violations of the free speech he claimed to champion. His faith in natural aristocracy, the belief that some men were simply better suited to govern, was elitist and wrong, though containing kernels of truth about expertise and knowledge. His pessimism about democracy, while containing wisdom, went too far, underestimating humanity's capacity for self-governance, even as he devoted his life to making it possible. The question he embodies is the question America still grapples with. Can a republic survive? Do we deserve to be free? Adams spent 90 years wrestling with these questions, never arriving at comfortable answers. He believed republics were the best form of government and also the most fragile. He believed humans were capable of self-governance and also prone to passion, faction, and demagoguery. He believed in American democracy enough to sacrifice everything for it, and doubted it enough to warn constantly about its dangers. Adams would say that freedom requires virtue, virtue requires effort, and effort requires institutions. You cannot have liberty through good intentions alone. You need constitutional architecture, separation of powers, checks and balances, rule of law, all the mechanisms that constrain power and protect rights even when people forget why those protections matter. His pessimism was realism. Democracy is hard. It requires constant vigilance. It can fail. The American experiment was improbable and fragile, maintained through effort rather than inevitability. This understanding drove Adams to work obsessively, to worry endlessly, to refuse complacency even when success seemed achieved. But hidden within his pessimism was optimism so deep he may not have recognized it. He gave his entire life to making Republican government work, despite believing it probably wouldn't. He fought for independence, despite knowing revolution might fail. He worked to build institutions despite doubting they would survive. The very fact that he tried, that he devoted 90 years to an experiment he thought was likely doomed, reveals faith stronger than Jefferson's sunny optimism. Peacefield still stands in Quincy, preserved now as a National Historic Site. Visitors walk through the rooms where Adams lived his final years, see his desk piled with books, the chair where he sat reading and writing, the bedroom where he died whispering Jefferson's name. His library remains, thousands of volumes, margins filled with his annotations, arguments with dead authors still visible in fading ink. His letters to Abigail, to Jefferson, to Rush, preserved in archives, testimony to a mind that never stopped working, never stopped questioning, never stopped trying to understand what they had attempted and what it meant. The documents he saved, drafts of resolutions, copies of letters, notes scribbled on scraps of paper, all evidence of someone who understood that words mattered, that ideas had power, that the American experiment was built not on force, but on argument, not on conquest, but on consent. All evidence of a mind that never stopped worrying. Would the Republic survive? Would faction destroy it? Would democracy devolve into tyranny? The questions that consumed him remain our questions. The challenges he warned about remain our challenges. Perhaps that is why his reputation has been resurrected, because we finally understand that his doubts were not weakness, but wisdom, that his warnings were not elitism, but realism. Perhaps that's why he whispered Jefferson's name at the end. Not rivalry, but recognition. They had done it together, the impossible thing. They had made a revolution of ideas, not just armies. They had argued a nation into existence. And 50 years later, on the same impossible day, they had let it go, trusting that the idea would outlive them both. One believed humanity was perfectible through reason and education. The other believed humanity was unchanging and required constant institutional restraint. One was optimistic about democracy's future. The other was skeptical but committed. Together, they created something neither could have created alone. A nation founded on the proposition that people could govern themselves, fragile but real, improbable but enduring. Adams would be pleased to know he was right about the need for institutional checks, about the dangers of faction, about the fragility of Republican government, about the necessity of law over passion, about almost everything he warned about and no one listened to until it was too late or just in time, and he would be insufferable about it, writing long letters to anyone who would listen, explaining how history had finally vindicated his wisdom, how if people had just listened to him in 1797, so many problems could have been avoided. Abigail would raise that eyebrow. He would sputter, then laugh despite himself, then admit that perhaps being remembered at all was achievement enough, which is exactly as it should be. John Adams, vain and virtuous, difficult and dedicated, wrong about some things and right about more, forgotten and remembered, human and therefore flawed, human and therefore essential. The founder we didn't want but needed, the conscience we tried to ignore but couldn't escape, the voice still asking the question that will not be silenced. Can a republic survive? The question remains. Adams would insist we keep asking it. That's the point.